How you doing? I'm Dr. Paul Dyer. Welcome to Bridges Live Presents. As you know me, I am Dr. Paul Dyer, and I am on a beautiful call with Mr. Dr. Gerald Horne. We're going to be talking about white supremacy, but ultimately, I think we're going to be talking about information that you may not have heard before, or you may not understood before. And I think there's a lot to do with hearing something and not understanding it. So, Gerald Horne, thank you for coming on with me with Bridges Live with Dr. Paul Dyer. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's get right to it. I'm not going to give the whole back. If people want to know who you are, they can look you up and go to Houston and all that stuff. And I really want to get more into information and cut all the bullshit, right? So the understanding is, what do people not understanding about white supremacy and the history of white supremacy? And I want to, as you talk it through, because I heard you speak, many people have probably heard you speak, but I put it out there that I was going to have you on, and literally probably about 20 people were like, I don't know who he is. And I was like, shame on you. So let's do that. What is it about the history of white supremacy people are missing?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that question because I'm not sure what they're missing.
Yeah.
It's like saying, what is it about the importance of water that people are missing?
Right.
I'm not sure how to answer that question. But briefly, I would say that if you look at my book on the 16th century, what you will discover is that during that time, there was contestation on a religious basis, not least between Ottoman Turkey, predominantly Muslim,
Right,
and Catholic powers, that is to say, Spain and Portugal in the first instance. As I tell the story, the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, were moving steadily west, and you may know that the Muslims had occupied Spain up until that pivotal year of 1492. And so as the Spanish sponsor Christopher Columbus to try to find a new route to the riches of Asia, and he bumps into the Americas, I'm sure your audience knows that.
right.
And then that unleashes a tidal wave of riches pouring into Spain. Then on the other hand, you have this minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, speaking of England, which had adopted and adapted the Protestant sect initiated by Martin Luther,
Right.
circa 1517. That unleashes even more antagonism, this time intra-Christian antagonism between Protestants and Catholics, between Spain and England in the first instance. And to make a long story short, because I wrote an entire book about it, it's hard to summarize in a few moments. What happens is that the English stumble onto this idea of race, that is to say, the question of constructing a identity politics known as whiteness that helps them to rectify conflicts that the English had with their Irish and Scottish antagonists.
Right.
When they cross the Atlantic, magically they're transmuted into this new category of whiteness,
Yeah.
which morphs into white supremacy. And then you flip that coin over, and those not inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness are then subject to be plundered, as in the case of the indigenous, or enslaved, as in the case of the Africans.
So
Now,
do you think
minutes of analysis of a very complicated story that took me hundreds of pages to write.
Yes. Do you think this was subjecticated to the religion-based process, or is it just the idea that they adapted when it comes to the English?
You're going to have to repeat that question.
So do you believe that was this idea developed from a religious prospect of Catholic and Protestant, or was it just a collaboration of strengthening a way in which they can control others?
Well, if I understand the question, it's mostly the latter. As I talk about in the book, this concept of race basically flows out of religion. Indeed, as I talk about it early on in the book, if you look at the Jewish population of England, which was expelled in the late 13th century, many of the tropes that were once applied to that stigmatized population, such as their alleged odor, the stigma that says they cannot marry non-Jewish people, etc. Some of that's sort of adopted in whole cloth for the Black population to a degree. So once again, I see this more as improvisational, more so than following a strict blueprint,
Gotcha.
but no less damaging nonetheless.
Now, and for me, when I try to help people with information and understanding, and hopefully to put them into an action that they could do something, understanding how this all came about. So all this comes about into control and colonization, which we know, and economics, really, right? Economics is building is it about building an empire, or is it about controlling people, or is it the same?
Well, those are more or less the same. When you build an empire, as the British did,
Right.
You're controlling people in South Asia, you're controlling people in the Caribbean, you're controlling people in Africa. So they're more or less equivalent.
How can the information through your books, has it helped me understand the process of where things come to and how things, because I like the inception of something, whether it be of a word or whether it be the history of things, because as people have said before, if you don't understand your history, we can deem to repeat it. But the common Black person doesn't look at history, and that's why things are being repeated, as is they're still being colonized by the lack of information that they have, or they don't understand the information of where it comes from?
Well, I think that there's a lot of ignorance by intention in this country. Wow. Because, as we know, there's another sociological category I have not yet mentioned. I've mentioned religion, right, as a marker of society. I've mentioned race as a marker of society. I've yet to mention class, although ultimately, with regard to the society in which we now reside, that's one of the most important, if not most profound, markers, because as we all know, there are some at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid who enjoy billions and riches, and that there are those at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid who are barely hanging on and barely surviving. And the survival of that society, that unsteady society, basically is grounded in a certain kind of ignorance. Because if people actually had knowledge of what was going on, they might try to revolt. That oftentimes happens throughout world history. They might try to rebel, but of course that has happened over the centuries in North America.
I mean, if people watching the live version of this show, and maybe if they're listening to the podcast version, behind me is a picture of William Still, one of my favorites, an abolitionist. But again, it's so hard to believe that the ignorance of people to not push forward is because they have a tendency to not understand the struggles and what people are trying to do to them and what they are doing to them. It seems perplexed to me. It seems like people are still talking about economic class system. Oh, I live here and I don't have this. But there's a systematic thing that's been going on for decades, centuries, that they haven't understood, and this is why they're still in the box.
Well, by the way, we're taping this, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. Well, that's part of the story. Of course, there's this phenomenon known as repression. That is to say, those who try to break out of the box oftentimes wind up 6 feet under or in prison or in exile. And that is also a so-called secret to the stability of this society.
So, let me ask a different way of this question. Do white people understand why they are or have been deemed white supremacist? Do they know that?
I would say that some do and many don't, especially in this country. Fortunately, in the recent years, there's been substantial research and writing not least by some who are defined as, quote, white, unquote, that have tried to pursue a historical analysis of this construction of whiteness and white supremacy. But sadly enough, it has not broken through on a mass level, although we remain optimistic that someday it will.
So is it helpful? It has to be helpful. I think it has to be helpful that not only blacks and African Americans and everyone should understand the history of how this came about.
Oh, that's for sure. Because as they say nowadays, this is going to be an all hands effort or an all hands on deck effort in order to dig ourselves out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves. And certainly, as a political person, what you want to do is win over as many possible potential allies as possible, or at least neutralize as many possible potential allies, or neutralize those who might want to turn against you, I should say. And obviously, that presupposes that we're going to need everybody in this struggle.
Now, the contention people have against one another, say like I'm against those people, I'm for those people, that's not going to work. Do you believe that's going to work? Historically, has that ever worked?
Well, it depends on what you mean by those people. If those people are the Ku Klux Klan and racist terrorists, well, sure, you should say I'm against those people.
Right.
As a matter of fact, you should try your damnedest to make sure those people are isolated and marginalized minimally. But if you're talking about somebody at your workplace or somebody at your place of worship, perhaps even someone in your neighborhood, who just happens to be uninformed or misinformed, I'm not sure if you should take the same approach to them as you would to the Ku Klux Klan.
But even the information we're talking about, since even Portugal and the European what European has done to colonize so many people, white America today doesn't connect with that. Matter of fact, they disconnect with that. So they don't understand the association of why this is systematically has happened and continues to happen. So how can they help if they are not willing to understand that this is just what the history says it is, not maybe what you believe it is, but this is just the history?
Well, I agree with you that a preponderance of those defined as white are stumbling around in the dark, stumbling around misinformed, malinformed, ignorant, etc. And to a certain extent, that may serve their material interests, because if they were really aware of what was going on, they might have sleepless nights. They might have to reverse course. So it's up to us, and this has been the historic secret to the struggle of Black people in particular, from the hellhole that was enslavement, is that you organize not only domestically, but globally. Because those who rule this country have many antagonists overseas. And historically, the wisest of our organizations and leaders have recognized that and have tried to leverage that for our benefit.
And they have. If you look at what the Russia and the Ukraine and how it has impacted globally, of what they would like to do with the people of Russia and the reasons why, I believe it's more economic than anything, not so much of what they disbelieve of their ideology. I still think they're trying to control some form of money that certain groups have that they want. And how can we as good people, understanding the history, how can we help dismantle the abuse that goes on globally and locally in our communities, in our state, in our country?
Well, first of all, we have to determine who our allies are abroad and who our antagonists are. I think that we here in the United States have much in common with people in the Caribbean and people in Africa. We have certain things in common with many people in Asia. We have many things in common, believe it or not, with certain folks in Europe. And so the question is to determine where the potential allies are and who are the antagonists, and then trying to build coalitions on that basis. I mean, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with Frederick Douglass,
yes, sir,
great 19th century abolitionist who crusaded against slavery before its abolition in the United States in 1865. Now, before the abolition of slavery, Britain and the United States were at each other's throats.
Right.
But Douglass chose to play up on that contradiction. He was in and out of London on a regular basis, and he wasn't flying. He was taking ships, taking days, if not weeks, and seeking to leverage London's strength against the slaveholders. The same holds true for Haiti. 1791 to 1804, you had the Haitian Revolution.
That's correct.
Creating an independent Black republic, which then Douglass and others tried to ally with in order to put pressure on slavery, and they basically succeeded. Now, one of the problems with Douglass is that after slavery was abolished in 1865, that global strategy basically disappeared, because I guess he thought that we were now full U.S. citizens and we should act like other U.S. citizens and let the State Department handle foreign policy.
Which was a fault. Was it a fault or a miscalculation?
Oh, it was both. I mean, it was certainly a miscalculation, which I sort of understand, because the Civil War, there were 700,000 deaths. Black Americans contributed heavily to that victory. There was a lot of rhetoric post 1865 about incorporating us fully into the body politic, but that was quickly reversed. And at that point, it seems to me there should have been a reversal of strategy, but it did not take place.
It didn't take. So again, that's what it's one of those troublesome I have is it didn't reverse, it didn't take place because either we not understand what the history was saying to us, or we didn't believe it was going to continue, and we just had to wait it out. Because it seems like a lot of the things that is happening 2022, we're still talking about 50, 60 years later from it still happening in the 60s, the 40s, the 30s. It's nothing's changed because either we're waiting it out or we don't believe that we should bring this to a revolutionary state.
I think part of the problem is that many of our leaders and many of our intellectuals really don't understand how we got to where we are in 2022. It reminds me of raising a child, for example, who fully expects dinner to be on the table every day, but it doesn't have that much of an idea of how and why that process takes place. And sadly, that sort of ignorance is applicable to many of our leaders. I mean, for example, I've done a lot of writing upon why Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, began to crumble in the 1950s. It not only crumbled because of those in this country beginning to realize that wrongs were being done to us, not only crumbled because we were struggling, it crumbled because of an international situation.
Right.
That is to say that the United States was under pressure, was trying to portray itself as a paragon of human rights virtue, and was having trouble appealing to hearts and minds as African and Caribbean and Asian nations were coming to independence as long as there was U.S. apartheid. And so that created objective pressure on the system to change. But many of our leaders and intellectuals don't even recognize that basic issue. They see the United States as a thing in itself, as sort of a black box.
Right.
I think it's flawed thinking at best.
And that's what, I have explained this about Jim Crow. People say, well, Jim Crow was this. I said, well, do you guys look at the global positioning, just like what you said? They were trying to do so much globally, but the other countries are like, have you looked at yourself? Why should you do anything? Have you looked inside your own house? And they're like, okay, we got to fix this, right? And that's why some marginal laws have passed, but yet they kept states' rights so strong. But I think Lincoln had that problem too. He didn't want to take over states' rights unless he empowered the War Powers Act. Is that correct?
Well, Lincoln was trapped in many contradictions. On the one hand, it seems that he was trying to deport the newly emancipated Negroes to whatever country would take us.
Right.
He was
Brazil,
with Brazil.
Yeah.
He was negotiating with the Dominican Republic. He was negotiating with Ecuador.
Right.
But for various reasons, these other countries says, thank you very much. We have enough black people. We don't need yours. And so the best I think you can say is that at least he didn't put us out on a boat and just send us off into Never Never Land without a destination.
I was thinking about Ron Santos and sending, and how I'm in Maryland and how he's sending people to D.C. and up in New England way. He's just, Lincoln almost did it. He was close. He was close. He was close. So the playbook that Ron Santos is doing, it's been almost done before. So,
well, it's even been done to black people. I mean, for example, you have the so-called reverse freedom rides, where the racists in the South say, okay, you people in the North, you supposedly like these Negroes, you should take them off our hands.
Right.
And they would induce black people to move north. In fact, some of them were deposited at the mansion of then U.S. President John F. Kennedy in 1962 in a Hyannisport in Massachusetts. So what Ron DeSantis is doing is not necessarily new.
No, it's old. And again, I think that has a lot, because when people talk about, I guess, with the talking heads of multimedias, they don't mention that information. And a lot of blacks don't understand that information. And again, for us to cut through that, to, lack of a better phrase, to get to the promised land, whatever that land is supposed to be, I think information, but understanding what they're not getting, is also highly important. Because there's things not being said, and then there's things that's being said that's being misused.
Well, that's for sure. And I should also say that in terms of this global effort, I think people need to realize that the global effort also manifested itself inside the country. I'm writing a book now on the city of Washington, D.C., not far from where you're sitting. And one of the pressures on the United States was that 1960 was the year of Africa. And so you had all of these newly independent sovereign African countries coming to Washington, trying to buy mansions to establish embassies.
Okay.
At the same time, you had their Euro-American neighbors who were objecting to these Africans moving in. So the State Department was in a dilemma because oftentimes these African diplomats, they couldn't get served on Route 40 going out of Washington through Maryland up to New York City to the United Nations. So they devised this plan to give these African diplomats a little button that they could put on the lapel, which would show that they were not U.S. Negroes. But of course, the U.S. Negroes, being ingenious, began to manufacture these buttons, adopt accents that indicate that they were not necessarily born in this country, and the whole plan fell apart. And so then that leads to pressure on Capitol Hill to pass laws that would encompass all black people, be they foreign or domestic. And that's one of the reasons why U.S. apartheid began to crumble.
Is there, being a historian, would you consider yourself a historian, or what would you call yourself a historian?
Among other things, yes.
Do you foresee a revolution coming that we, as a collective we, not just African Americans or melanin people, whoever, but the we that we need to pull this together, all hands on deck, is going to happen? Or is it still going to be a separation of the few that tries to push this, which is going to end up in more dead than successful?
It's hard to say at this point. I think either of those paths are possible. Certainly, I'm also doing a book on the Black Panther Party.
My dad was a Black Panther.
Oh, in what city?
Chicago.
Oh, I see. So he's familiar with Fred Hampton.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I admire the militancy. Mm-hmm. I admire the intelligence. I admire the courage. But they really never did an analysis of the forces. I mean, if you go to a military academy and train to be either a lieutenant or a general, you're supposed to do an analysis of the opponent.
Correct.
Before you lead your troops into battle.
Right. Because
sometimes you may decide to retreat instead of advance. And so the Black Panther Party really never did an analysis of U.S. history, for example. And in fact, they oftentimes accepted the glorification that passes for history. They were praising the Constitution as this noble document. praising the founding, etc., which is basically propaganda. And so if you're accepting the propaganda, well, then it's difficult to escape the propaganda, or as the late feminist Audre Lorde once said, it's difficult to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And that's, in a sense, what the Panthers were trying to do.
My dad has passed, and my family has always been activists in its own right and doing what they do and helping the community build. Anyway, what I think got away from the Black Panthers, besides J. Edgar Hoover putting in all those different people to be antagonistic, I don't think they thought, like you said, ahead of themselves. I think they went from a education program, food program, and helping communities to it got away from them. I think it got into almost like it caught fire faster than they thought it would.
Well, to their credit, and I should mention this on the other side of the ledger, they did try to operate internationally. To their credit, they had a de facto embassy in Algeria, North Africa. They sent delegations to Congo Brazzaville. They sent delegations to Indochina, to China, to North Korea, to various parts of Western Europe, to Cuba. So that was to their credit. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you have historians like myself who try to sift through the ashes and come up with a story so people can extract what is positive and try to shun what is negative.
As a historian and seeing pieces as you did as extracting and sifting through, what are some of the key points you have found thus far, because there's always going to be more, that would help move us forward and to help us stabilize what is going on so we can do better?
Well, the basics are that we need more organization.
We have tons. We have
like
tons.
What?
I mean, I guess we have organizations. It seems like everyone's got a nonprofit to do something for someone.
I'm talking about political organizations.
Gotcha. Okay.
I mean, not just Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, not just the Sunday Church Social, but political organizations that are challenging the establishment, that are challenging the elite, that has global connections, that has study groups to educate its members, that sends delegations abroad, that sends delegations to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland,
Right.
that encourages the United Nations to come to the United States and do human rights investigations. So we need organization if we're really serious.
But the two-party system is going to put a poo-poo on that. They don't want other things to come to light to put them, to shine the light on them and saying, look at all the nastiness you actually collectively do in your party system. I'm not sure if they're going to allow that to happen, which is why it's disturbing, because now you look at the courts, and it doesn't matter who's on the courts, but you look at the courts and what they're not doing or what they are doing, and then the executive branches, I don't know if there's ever been a great executive branch that hasn't had some collusion with each other from years past. So it's the same playbook, just different players.
You are correct to suggest that the obstacles are formidable. However, we also had a two-party system when Jim Crow began to crumble. But I think what happened, as suggested a moment or two ago, was organizing globally, taking advantage of the changed global balance of forces, for example, putting pressure and using leverage with regard to African and Caribbean nations coming to independence and sovereignty at a particular historical moment. And we have to apply that same sort of intelligence to 2022. But the problem is that I think, number one, the wrong conclusions were drawn with regard to understanding how and why Jim Crow began to crumble. Some of us believe that it's because we began to beat our chests and shout Black Power. We got scared and decided to retreat. Others say that we were sympathetic because in our angelic protests, we allowed ourselves to be battered from pillar to post.
Right.
Well, I think both of those explanations are almost silly.
They are.
That there were complex factors that took place that put wind in our sails. Because if you don't have wind in your sails, it's going to be very difficult to get to your destination.
Now, just recently, as we know, this queen of she has passed, and I still don't hear people talking about the colonization that they have been doing since the 1500s.
Mm-hmm.
And why isn't that talked about? And then because she's dead, it should be highly talked about the role that they have played on since the 1500s to date, and how it's controlled the actions of the United States to date, and how they're trying to control the European Union to date.
Well, you're presupposing, I assume, that there's a certain kind of consciousness in the U.S. mass media.
Yes.
But if there's consciousness, it's reactionary consciousness, it's backward consciousness, it's retrograde consciousness. They have a material interest in throwing dust in the eyes of the public. They don't even want to acknowledge that supposedly the United States was born in a revolt against London. Somehow that too has been forgotten. And I think it's part of the cover-up, and it's also part of the process of propaganda, of people beginning to think that this so-called royal family, one of the richest families on planet Earth, by the way, which are not taxed, which are some of the strongest landlords on planet Earth, and these royal families have an inglorious history of marrying each other, oftentimes violating the incest taboo, which then leads to physical and mental deformities. I'm not even sure, quite frankly, if King Charles III is all there. And certainly the royal families have their own iteration of whiteness. For example, Queen Elizabeth II was married to Greek royalty, meaning King Charles III is half Greek. And historically, there have been these sorts of intra-European alliances. I should add a footnote, which I wrote about in another book, which is that in the 1930s, the royal family of Japan proposed a merger with the royal family of Ethiopia. Now, if a European royal family had proposed a merger with the Ethiopian royal family, they might have been tossed out on their ear. And of course, things did not end up very well for Japan after making those sorts of overtures, not least because an atomic bomb, the first and let's hope the only time that it was used, was dropped on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in August 1945.
I actually believe, and when you mentioned that union that they was trying to do, I think the bomb had more to do with that than to do with the war. Am I out there on a limb for speculating that?
Well, I think they're complex factors. I mean, I wrote this book, Facing the Rising Sun, which I recommend to you and your audience's attention. And so what Japan was trying to do was sort of like a jujitsu maneuver, turning the strength of the North Atlantic countries against itself, against the North Atlantic countries. In other words, the strength was colonialism against people of color. And so Japan came up with the idea, you know what? We're going to recruit all the people of color against the North Atlantic countries. Indeed, as I say in the book, this concept of the Asiatic Black Man, which you have certain rappers still use today, although I'm not sure they know what it means or where it came from, it basically comes out of the 1930s, when you had many Black Americans who were embarrassed about being African because Africa was under colonial domination. Japan was the rising power, and so they identified with Japan. They said that they were Asiatic, for example. But alas, that particular project came a cropper in August 1945 when the United States dropped the bomb.
Right. So that's why I said I believe, because I knew that they were trying to flip it on itself. And so they bombed Japan to kill that idea because they didn't want the African countries to come up. That's why they did. I mean, they could have bombed anyone else and it would have ended the war if that's what the bomb was supposed to do. So why Japan? And people would say, well, what about, the attack on Pearl Harbor? First of all, they were trying to get through the Pacific. It had nothing to do with the United States. It had everything to do with the shipping lanes. So I don't think Japan was looking at attacking the U.S. particular. They were just trying to control the ocean, if that makes sense.
Well, I think there's a distinction between the different theaters of war. If you look at the Italian fascists and the German fascists, they were attacking sovereign countries. Germany occupied France, which of course was a colonizing power in its own right. Japan was attacking European colonies. Indonesia was under the rule of the Dutch. Indochina was under the rule of the French. Hong Kong was under the rule of the British. And so there's a different character with regard to the Pacific theater and the European theater. But at the same time, it's not perhaps accidental that those of Japanese ancestry from Seattle to San Diego are interned, that is to say, the euphemism for being put in concentration camps, between 1941 and 1945. We did not necessarily see German Americans and Italian Americans who were interned, and you should draw reasonable inferences from that distinction.
There's so much. I'm a reader myself. I don't think the new youthful America are readers, and I think that's why I do this type of conversation. But there are so many books that you've written, that many people have written, that I think logically is a teaching tool for the home of America, maybe not the school of America, because the school always draws an inference to deter you from the truth and give you their opinion on some writings. But I think if it's done at home, then you can have a conversation.
Well, as you know, as I'm sure you know, one positive habit that many parents have is to read to their children before they go to bed at night. And that helps to engender the habit of reading and learning early on. And that's one of the most important habits that a parent can possess. That is to say, reading to your child.
Right.
Then, as the child learns how to read, then to give that child a library card, or alternatively, or in addition, making sure that that child has a number of books in their room. I grew up in a working class community in St. Louis, Missouri. My father was a teamster, a truck driver. My mother oftentimes did domestic labor. And yet, I still remember getting my first library card. And I still remember walking to the St. Louis Public Library and looking through the shelves and taking out books. And I should also say that I was a child laborer. I began as a child laborer selling newspapers, selling the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat from the age of 7, getting robbed in the streets by young toughs. But I also began to read the newspapers at an early age, admittedly just the sports page and the comic strips.
It's reading.
It's still reading. And of course, that's still a habit I possess to this very day. The first thing in the morning, read the newspaper.
Right. I hope people listen to this, Dr. Gerald Horne, and our conversation, and play it back. And as you play it back, you're going to have some questions. Reach out, ask the questions. I think a question unasked is something you're not learning. I think there's more questions that people are afraid to ask, and I don't know why that is. When we are in the age of ask the question, not just seek it out, but learn how to feel it out. And I want to thank you, Dr. Horne, very much for coming on. It's an honor to have you on, because I love educators such as yourself, historians such as yourself, but people who not just put it into text and words, but understand the connection between the human spirit and why it needs to be heard. Because I think still people write for information and they don't put together the soulful spiritual act of how it connects to us as human beings, as people. And I think that's one of those things that splits us, and I think that's why we're still able to be colonized mentally and emotionally. We may not be colonized in a physical, at least that's what the people think. I think it's the cage unseen, so to speak. Because if you're colonized mentally and emotionally, you're still under the rule. And under the rule is something you don't know, and that's why you're unable to get out. Anything you'd like to say before you take off?
Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to receiving the link from our conversation. And I would be remiss if I failed to mention the books that I've written. I won't mention them all, but
please.
I'm not underground yet, so you can find them online.
Right. You think you'll ever be there? How about this? Do you think if it was at a different time, it would be McCarthyism on the things you've written already? You think you'd be on that list?
I think about that a lot, and I plan for that catastrophe.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I do tell. Like, what do you say? What you said it. Explain to people what do you mean then?
Well, I have backup plans with regard to countries in which I can find exile.
Right. For
example, keep my passport up to date in terms of getting into said country or countries. And I'm in touch with people in these countries on a regular basis, so they won't be surprised if I have to call upon them.
Right, right.
So, but let's hope that Plan B does not have to be executed.
But Plan A is to do the work we can do here, but always have the Plan B.
Exactly.
I'm almost reluctant to even ask a question because so many people key on fear, and that's just the brain science of people are about their own personal survival. So I'm not even going to ask the question, but I think people are now curious of what I mean. Is there a time? Can you give a time frame that B will have to be implemented?
Oh, God.
Not just for you, but for the country as a whole. There's an exit.
Well, the way this country is going, it could happen sooner than we think.
I've been saying it's going to happen sooner than what you think, and I too have a Plan B. I agree. I worked very hard on Plan A, but I too, and there's people I've talked to that have Plan B. Let's do this, but let's be prepared to do this, right? Because as I don't think people are fully understanding, and that's why I do these shows. I want people to get the information and really understand it. Because after you have those two and you choose not to develop an action or a Plan B, I might be perplexed, but that's a choice. But I don't think you have a choice if you never understood what is being put out there and why it's being put out there. You're just going along with a reactionary. And that's never good.
Well, I understand because people like to be able to sleep at night and they feel that ignorance is bliss, as the saying used to be, and that out of sight, out of mind, to use another cliche. The problem occurs when the situation changes drastically.
Right.
And history is replete with folks being liquidated because they did not contemplate a disaster lurking around the corner and just over the horizon.
Give a couple of the books that you would like people to really key on. I would like to tell people about understanding white supremacy, understanding the revolution. There's certain books you've written. You've written so many, but give some of the books that were some of your favorites. Not favorites, but that people really gotta pick up and.
Well, it depends. I would say for people in the United States, that 16th century book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse.
Yeah. For
people in the Caribbean, my book on the Haitian Revolution, Confronting Black Jacobinism, and in fact, for Black Americans generally. For people in the United States and around the world, my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which I think presents a more accurate view
yes.
of what happened to create this country now known as the United States of America. And for those interested in the 20th century, I would point to my biography of the late, great Paul Robeson, one of my own personal heroes, the tallest tree in our forest, who was...
He was my mother's favorite.
Oh, good for her.
Yeah.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Brilliant, spoke dozens of languages, toured the world, but ran afoul of the United States authorities because he refused to cease his struggle against Jim Crow and racism.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there because I don't want to overload people with detail.
Again, thank you so much. I wish you all the blessings and compassion that I could ever muster up. And please be safe out there. And if you have to enact Plan B, maybe I'll see you on the other side.
Okay. I'll hold you to that.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to Bridges Live. I'm Dr. Paul Dyer, and you're listening to with Dr. Gerald Horn. We will see you again anytime soon, every day, every week. Many blessings. Thank you.
Okay.